2 miles of concrete sit cracked and empty in the potato fields of northern Maine, 4 miles from the Canadian border. This runway was poured thick enough to launch nuclear bombers toward Moscow. In August 1997, it held roughly 70,000 people, one of the largest crowds in Maine's history. Not for war, for a rock concert. 3 years earlier, this was Loring Air Force Base, home to armed B-52s, 10,000 people, and one of America's first nuclear weapon storage sites. Then a committee voted, and it all disappeared. The question is why anyone built it here at all. The answer is on any globe. Lay a string from the continental United States to Moscow, and the shortest path does not cross the Atlantic the way a flat map suggests. It bends over the pole, and the piece of American soil closest to that polar route is the far northeastern corner of Maine, Aroostook County, a region of potato farms, spruce forest, and winters that bury fences. So in 1947, before most Americans had ever heard the phrase Cold War, before the Air Force was even a year old as its own service, crews started cutting a bomber base out of the woods near a town called Limestone. Nothing about the project was modest. The runway stretched to 12,100 feet, well over 2 miles, because the aircraft it was built for demanded it. The B-36 Peacemaker was the largest bomber America had ever fielded, with a wingspan of 230 feet, and Loring built a home worthy of it. A monolithic double-cantilever concrete arch hangar, a curved roof big enough to swallow the machine whole. It was reportedly among the most expensive airbase construction projects the country had attempted to that point. The government was pouring a concrete city into farmland, on the theory that the next war would come over the ice. In 1953, the 42nd Bombardment Wing arrived, and the theory got engines. A year later, the base took its permanent name, and the name tells you what kind of logic ran this place. Major Charles J. Loring, Jr., a fighter pilot from Portland, Maine, had died in Korea on November 22, 1952, deliberately diving his damaged F-80 into a Chinese artillery position to protect the troops below. He received the Medal of Honor. The Air Force put his name on a base built entirely around the idea of one-way missions. But the runway and the arch hangar were only the visible half of Loring. In the woods next door, behind multiple fence lines and its own guard force, sat rows of earth-covered concrete bunkers, a weapons storage complex often described as among the first operational nuclear storage sites in the United States, though records from those early atomic years remain incomplete. From the air, the bunkers looked like burial mounds with grass roofs. The farm families of Aroostook County had watched the forest come down and taken the construction jobs. Now they lived beside the most destructive weapons ever built, and most of them were never told exactly what sat behind those fences. For the next 40 years, that arrangement would simply be called normal. Normal at Loring sounded like a klaxon. When the horn ripped through the base, crews sprinted to B-52s that sat fueled and armed on an alert apron shaped like a Christmas tree, angled parking stubs branching off a central taxiway, geometry designed so bombers could roll and launch in minutes. The crews on alert lived in a facility beside the pad for days at a time, fathers technically home, but sealed behind a fence a mile from their own kitchens. Families learned to sleep through the drills. Children rode bikes within sight of the fencing around the weapons area and stopped noticing it. That is what 4 decades of nuclear readiness does. It turns the unthinkable into a schedule. And the schedule did not care about weather. Aroostook County takes more than 100 inches of snow in a typical year, and Strategic Air Command expected armed bombers to be launchable through all of it. Plow crews worked the runway through blizzards like their machines were part of the war plan, because they were. KC-135 tankers flew alongside the bombers, which meant fuel, oceans of it, stored in a sprawling farm of tanks and pipelines. That fuel would matter again later, in a way nobody at the time wanted to imagine. Around the mission, the Air Force built a complete American town. Base housing streets with lawns and driveways, schools sized for thousands of rotating military kids, a third of some classrooms turning over every summer with new orders, a chapel, a hospital, a commissary, a theater, a bowling alley. At its height, roughly 10,000 people were connected to Loring, and the base stood as the largest employer in Aroostook County, with over 1,000 local civilians on the payroll. Limestone's diners and bars ran on shift changes. Car dealers and landlords ran on federal paychecks. Once a year, at the air show, the town got to walk up and touch the machine it lived beside. The bombers were armed. The bake sales went on. Concrete that thick, a payroll that wide, a mission that important. How could it not be? But the whole arrangement rested on a single fact. Loring existed because it was closer to the Soviet Union than any other bomber base in America. One enemy, one route, one reason. There was no port here, no industry, no fallback purpose. Just distance to Moscow, converted into jobs. And the Pentagon noticed the fragility before the town did. In 1976, Washington moved to gut the base, and Loring landed on the chopping block. Maine's congressional delegation went to war over it. Hearings, pressure, years of political fighting followed, and by the end of the decade, the drawdown was reversed. Loring survived. The town celebrated and drew the obvious conclusion. If the politicians could save the base once, they could save it every time. Permanence proven. That was the wrong lesson. The 1970s fight had not been won on strategy. It had been won on politics, and politics is a stay of execution, not a pardon. The real verdict was still sitting in the geography, waiting. Because far away, through the 1980s, the enemy that justified every foot of that runway was beginning to come apart at the seams, and every brick and limestone, every paycheck, every classroom depended on that enemy staying alive. The first official death notice didn't come from the Pentagon. It came from the EPA. In 1990, with B-52s still flying, Loring was added to the Superfund National Priorities List, the Federal Registry of America's most contaminated ground. Decades of the mission had leaked into the earth, jet fuel plumes spreading under the fuel farm, solvents like TCE in the groundwater, PCBS, old landfills buried across the property. The government documented the poison while still running the machine that made it. The mission itself had less time left than the fuel. In September 1991, Strategic Air Command stood down from continuous alert, and the klaxons that had structured life at Loring went quiet. That same year, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission worked down its list and recommended Loring for elimination. Maine's delegation fought again, the way they had in the 1970s. This time, the argument had a hole in it the size of a country. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. The enemy Loring was aimed at cease to exist on paper, months after the commission had already signed the base's death warrant. No bomb ever fell on Loring. A budget line did. On September 30th, 1994, the flag came down. Then came the part no ceremony covers, moving trucks in convoys, base housing going dark street by street, classrooms losing children by the dozen. The census tells the story in two numbers. In 1990, Limestone counted roughly 9,900 people. By 2000, about 2,400. 3 out of every 4 people gone. The commissary closed. The diners lost their shift changes. The largest employer in the county became a fence line. The afterlife came in strange layers. A Job Corps center moved into old base buildings. A defense finance and accounting office backfilled some jobs for a time. In the old maintenance shops where crews had serviced B-52s, the Maine Military Authority began refurbishing Army Humvees, the redevelopment success story, until the contracts dried up and the operation shut down around 2019, taking hundreds of jobs with it. The The town lost the base twice. The land itself went wilder. In 1998, about 4,700 acres became the Aroostook National Wildlife Refuge. The grass-roofed nuclear bunkers that once held the most guarded weapons in America now shelter wildlife. Bald eagles work the old flight line. Amish families reportedly settled in the region in the years after closure, farming ground the jet age had claimed. And the cleanup crews stayed longest of all. White monitoring well caps dotted the fields, warning signs on remediation fences, the government's handwriting left behind. The base closed, the fuel in the ground stayed. Which brings it back to the runway. In August 1997, 3 years after the mission died, a band called Fish staged a festival on those 2 miles of concrete. Roughly 70,000 people came, reportedly the highest-grossing rock concert in America that year, and for 1 weekend, Dead Loring outdrew every living city in Maine. The crowds came back in 1998 and again in 2003. Then the concrete went quiet for good. Today the arch hangar still curves against the horizon, too massive to demolish, too big to fill. The gate still stands, and the runway built to launch the end of the world lies cracked in the potato fields, its happiest days behind it, all of them after it died.